A man like Emery Hagan didn't look for trouble. He'd already had his share, buried it deep in the dirt right next to his wife and the child they never got to hold. That kind of loss teaches a man to keep his head down, to find peace in the silence of a sprawling ranch and the low murmur of cattle at dusk. He hired the woman, Ruth, to cook his meals and mend his shirts. He didn't hire her to bring the devil to his doorstep. But the devil came anyway. It started with a bruise, just a flicker of angry purple on her forearm as she reached for the skillet. She was fast, pulling her sleeve down before he could get a good look, but Emery saw it. He saw it, and the quiet in his kitchen suddenly felt different. It felt heavy, dangerous. He didn't say a word. He just ate his biscuits, which were burnt on the bottom because his mind was somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about the 6 months she'd been there. A widow, she'd said, needed the work. She was quiet, polite, never complained, kept to her small room behind the pantry and never asked for a thing except her pay. He knew nothing about her, and until that moment, he preferred it that way. Curiosity was a costly thing. He'd learned that the hard way. But then she poured his coffee, and as her fingers brushed the ceramic mug, she winced. Just a tiny, almost invisible flinch. And he saw another one. Another bruise, this one darker, uglier, wrapped around her wrist like a sick bracelet. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. She noticed him staring. Her shoulders tensed, and she turned to leave, to disappear back into the shadows she seemed so comfortable in. But Emery's voice, rough from disuse, cut through the quiet. "Who did that to you?" She froze. Her back was to him, but he could feel the stillness, the sudden stop of her breath. "I ain't a fool, Ruth," he said, his voice softer now, but with an edge of steel she hadn't heard before. "And you ain't clumsy. So you tell me who's been putting his hands on you." The world seemed to hold its breath in the pause that followed. When she finally turned, her face was a blank mask. Not scared, not angry, just tired. So deeply tired it looked like it was carved into her bones. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice flat. "It's done." Emery pushed his chair back, the scrape of wood on the floorboards echoing like a gunshot. "You don't get to say that, not in my house." "I believe it's none of your business," she shot back, her arms folding across her chest. It wasn't defiance, it was defense. She was holding herself together. "You hired me to cook. I'm cooking, that's all." But it wasn't all, not anymore. He could see it all now, the little things he'd ignored. The way she'd jump at the sound of a falling pan, the gloves she wore in the summer heat, the long, haunted stares into the fireplace, as if she was expecting the flames to speak. He took a step closer, not threatening, just closing the distance. "You ain't alone here," he said, his voice low and steady. "Not unless you want to be." For a split second, something in her face cracked. Her lip trembled. Then the mask was back in place. He didn't push. He just walked to the back door and stared out at the darkening plains, the weight of her secret settling over his land. That night, sleep wouldn't come. He heard her moving around past midnight, the quiet clink of a jar, the soft scrape of a chair. He crept to his door and peered into the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, a single lamp casting long shadows on the wall. A scarf was wrapped tightly around her wrist. In her hands, she held a bruised apple, peeling away the damaged skin with a small knife, her movements slow and methodical. She wasn't crying. She was just staring at the exposed flesh of the apple as it turned brown in the air. And Emery knew, deep in his gut, that this was just the beginning. The rot was deeper than a few bruises, and it was already seeping into the soil of his ranch. The next morning, the bruises were hidden again beneath long sleeves, but Emery couldn't unsee them. They were burned into his mind. Later that week, he was fixing a latch on the barn when he saw them. Wagon tracks, fresh ones, deep ruts in the dirt that didn't belong to his cart. They led from the main road, stopped right near the pantry window where Ruth slept, and then led away again. Someone had been here, in the dead of night. His blood ran cold. He strode into the house, his face a storm cloud. He found Ruth on her knees, scrubbing the kitchen floor. Her sleeves were rolled up. He knelt beside her, his voice a low growl. "Who was here, Ruth?" She didn't look up. "Just a traveler. Lost his way." "Don't you lie to me," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I saw the tracks. They stopped right outside your window." She froze. Her whole body went rigid. Then a broken sound escaped her lips, so quiet he almost missed it. "He won't stop." "Who won't stop?" Emery demanded. Her hands began to tremble, the scrubbing rag falling from her grasp. "His name is Luther Kane." The name meant nothing to Emery, but the terror in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. "You want me to get the sheriff?" he asked, his mind already racing. She shook her head, a violent, desperate motion. "No, the law can't help me. He has friends, money. He buys silence everywhere I go. They'll laugh you out of town." Emery stood up, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "Then I guess it's time someone didn't stay silent." Ruth looked up at him, her eyes wide with a terrifying mix of disbelief and a tiny, flickering spark of hope. "You don't even know me." "No," Emery said, his gaze fixed on the horizon outside the window. "But I know what it feels like to bury someone you love and spend the rest of your life wondering if you could have done more." He turned to look at her, his eyes dark with a pain she was just beginning to understand. "I ain't burying someone again." That night, as the sun bled out across the plains, neither of them saw the lone figure watching the ranch from the deep shadows of the cottonwood trees. He watched the lamplight flicker in the kitchen window, and then, with a slow, deliberate smile, he turned his horse and melted back into the darkness. The storm was coming. The next day broke bruised and gray, the color of the sky matching the fear in Ruth's eyes. She moved through the kitchen like a ghost, her silence a heavy shroud. Emery watched her from the porch, nursing a cup of coffee. He saw her hang laundry, her movements jerky and uncertain. She dropped a clothespin and bent to pick it up, but froze halfway down. Her gaze was locked on the road leading into town. Emery followed her line of sight and saw him, a single rider on a black horse. He moved at a slow, deliberate pace, the kind of pace a wolf uses when it knows the sheep are already trapped. He didn't need to hurry. Fear was already doing his work for him. Ruth scrambled back inside the house, her face ashen. "That's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. Emery stepped inside, grabbing the heavy shotgun from the rack by the door. "He doesn't look so big from here." "He doesn't need to be," she said, her eyes wide with a terror that was old and deep. They watched as the rider, Luther Kane, stopped at the property line. He didn't get off his horse. He didn't shout a threat. He just sat there, a dark statue of menace, his eyes fixed on the house. It was a power play, a message. "I am here. I can reach you whenever I want." Then, as slowly as he arrived, he turned the horse and disappeared back the way he came. The moment he was gone, Ruth collapsed into a chair, a long, shuddering sob escaping her lips. It was as if she'd been holding herself up with nothing but sheer will, and it had finally snapped. Emery stood in the doorway, the shotgun feeling heavy in his hands. "I'm going to town," he said, his voice grim. "No!" Ruth's voice was sharp, desperate. "I told you, the sheriff won't help. Luther owns him. He owns the judge. He buys toys for the orphans at Christmas and donates to the church. They'll call me a liar and you a fool." "I ain't going to the sheriff," Emery said, his eyes hard as flint. He set the shotgun down. "I'm going to see a man, an old friend. Used to be a ranger before he lost an eye and took a bullet to the leg." He looked at Ruth, and for the first time, she saw the ghost of a fire in his eyes. "A man like that doesn't care about money or politics," Emery said. "He only cares about justice." Hope, fragile and dangerous, flickered in Ruth's face. "You'd do that for me?" "This ain't for you, Ruth," he said, turning to saddle his horse. "This is about what's right." He rode off without another word, leaving Ruth watching the dust rise behind him. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation bloom in her chest. It felt a little like safety, but that feeling wouldn't last. The ranch felt unnervingly quiet after Emery left. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, sent a fresh jolt of fear through Ruth. By late afternoon, she was in the pantry, the small, windowless room feeling more like a cage than a storeroom. She was sorting jars of preserves when she heard a floorboard creak right behind her. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs, ready to face the devil himself. But it was just Emmy, the young ranch hand, no older than 17, twisting his hat in his hands. "Miss Ruth," he stammered, his face pale. There's a man at the gate. He's asking for you." Her blood turned to ice. "What kind of man?" "Tall," Emmy whispered. "Wears a black hat. He's real polite, but he doesn't blink much. Said he had a message for you." Ruth nearly knocked over a shelf of pickled beans as she scrambled past the boy. She ran out the back, her feet flying across the dry-packed earth. As she neared the front gate, she saw it. There was no rider, no horse, just a single, clean white envelope nailed to the fence post. Her name was written on it in perfect, elegant script. She ripped it down, her fingers trembling as she broke the seal. There was no signature, no long, rambling threat, just 6 simple, chilling words. "You're not worth dying for, Ruth." The ink was black, but she saw blood. She saw Emery's blood. This wasn't a threat against her, it was a threat against him. Luther was telling her to run, to abandon the one man who had offered her a shield, to leave him to face the consequences alone. She turned to Emmy, her voice sharp and commanding. "Get the other hands, lock the barn, bar the hen house. I want every man and every animal secured before dark. No one goes out, no one." The boy just stared, then nodded and ran. Ruth raced back to the house, bolting every door, jamming chairs under the knobs. She took Emery's shotgun from the rack, the cold weight of it both terrifying and comforting. She sat in a corner of the kitchen, the gun across her lap, and waited for the sun to die. Emery returned long after midnight. The sound of his horse's hooves was like a drumbeat of doom in the suffocating silence. When he knocked, she didn't answer. "Ruth! It's me!" She cracked the door, the barrel of the shotgun pointed right at his chest. He didn't flinch. He just raised his hand slowly. "Easy now." She lowered the gun, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "You came back." "Of course I came back," he said, stepping inside, his eyes immediately scanning the fortified room. "Did you see him?" "No," she said, her voice shaking as she handed him the note. "But he was here." Emery read the 6 words. His face, already grim, hardened into a mask of cold fury. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his pocket. "Did you find your friend?" Ruth asked, her voice a whisper. "I did," Emery said. "The ranger. He's willing to help. Said he just needs a name, a face, and a reason." He looked at her, his eyes locking with hers. "I told him he'd have all 3 by morning. But Luther, he doesn't fight fair," she whispered, the hope in her chest battling a lifetime of fear. Emery's hand rested on the stock of the shotgun she still held. "Neither do I." That night, they didn't sleep. They sat in the dim lamplight, listening to the house settle, listening for the sound of approaching hooves. And as the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky a bloody red, they saw them. Dust on the horizon. But it wasn't one rider this time. It was 3. Emery stood on the porch, his own shotgun now slung over his back. Ruth stood beside him, a revolver clutched in her hand, a weapon she hadn't touched in years. As the riders drew closer, 2 of them peeled off, circling the property like vultures. But the third one, the one in the black hat, kept coming. It was Luther. He dismounted at the fence, moving with a lazy arrogance that made Ruth's skin crawl. He walked toward the house, stopping a dozen paces from the porch. "Morning, rancher," Luther said, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "You don't belong here," Emery replied, his voice flat and cold. "Just came to collect what's mine," Luther sneered, his eyes flicking to Ruth. She's a runner, that one, but they always come home. She's not yours, Emery said. Not anymore. Luther's smile widened. You really think you can stop me? A broken-down farmer playing hero? I don't think, Emery said. I act. And right on cue, a new figure stepped out from the shadows of the house. He was older, with a weathered face and a black patch over one eye. He moved with a slight limp, but there was a straightness to his spine that spoke of unbendable will. It was the one-eyed ranger. He didn't say a word. He just walked down the porch steps and stood beside Emery. The air crackled with tension. Luther's smug grin faltered. The confidence in his eyes flickered. Now hold on, Luther said, taking a half-step back. I've got no quarrel with you, old man. The ranger just stared, his one good eye colder than a winter grave. You're playing a dangerous game, rancher, Luther spat, his gaze snapping back to Emery. That woman has caused more trouble than she's worth. She's not causing me trouble, Emery said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. She's giving me purpose. Luther's face tightened into a snarl. The ranger finally spoke, his voice dry as dust and bones. You're trespassing. All right, Luther snarled, backing toward his horse. I'll leave, for now, but don't mistake this for mercy. You should go, the ranger said, his hand hovering near the matched pair of revolvers on his hip. Before I mistake it for permission. Luther mounted his horse and galloped away, his two men following close behind. But the dust they kicked up wasn't a retreat. It was a promise. Ruth stepped out onto the porch, trembling. Thank you, she whispered to the ranger. He just nodded. He'll be back, he said to Emery, and he'll bring more than 2 men next time. The ranger agreed to stay in town for a few days, a silent guardian angel watching from afar. But even with that assurance, the ranch felt like it was sitting on a powder keg. That night, Ruth couldn't sleep. The past, held at bay for so long, came rushing back in a torrent of ugly memories. The first time Luther had hit her, the shock, the betrayal, followed by the sweet poison of his apologies and promises. The bruises he'd hidden on her ribs, her back, places where pride and clothing could cover the shame. She'd run not just from the pain, but from the terrifying part of herself that had started to believe she deserved it. She found Emery sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. My wife, he said suddenly, his voice soft. She used to bake when she was nervous. The whole house would smell of cinnamon. What happened to her? Ruth asked gently. Fever, he said, his voice hollow. One day she was here. The next, gone. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a grief so profound it was almost a physical presence in the room. Do you think someone like me deserves a second chance? He wasn't talking about himself. I think, Emery said, his gaze steady and clear, someone like you deserves peace. Her throat tightened. A man like Luther doesn't let things go. Then we won't let you go either. A few days later, Emery rode to town for supplies. He left Ruth with the ranch hands and a long list of chores. But around midday, she saw the boys gathered near the fence line, whispering. She followed their gaze and saw it. Another letter, nailed to a tree stump. This time, it was addressed to her real name, a name she hadn't used in years. Ruth Esther Malloy. She ripped it open, her heart pounding. 1 week. You come back to me, or the man you're hiding behind won't live to see the sunrise. The choice is yours. L. She ran back to the house, the shotgun in her hands, her eyes wild with terror. When Emery returned, she met him at the gate. He's going to kill you, she cried, thrusting the letter at him. Emery read it, his face unreadable. He folded it and put it in his pocket. Then he better bring more than a pen next time. He sent a wire to the ranger that night. The reply was short and to the point. Tell her to pack a bag. We're not defending. We're attacking. The next morning, as the sun turned the hills to smoldering embers, the 3 of them rode out. Emery, the quiet rancher who had found his fire. Ruth, the battered woman who had found her spine. And the one-eyed ranger, a ghost of justice riding back into the fray. They were heading straight for Luther's ranch. "Cowards only roar when they feel safe," the ranger had said, his voice like grinding stones. "We're going to take his safety away." They rode for 2 days, sleeping in shifts, the silence between them filled with unspoken prayers and grim determination. They reached Luther's land at dawn on the 3rd day. It was a fortress, high fences topped with barbed wire, armed guards patrolling the perimeter. A big stone house loomed on a ridge, smoke curling from the chimney like a foul breath. "He's expecting trouble," Emery murmured. "No," the ranger corrected, his one good eye scanning the compound. "He's expecting her to come crawling back alone." They waited for the cover of darkness. The ranger vanished into the shadows to the west, a phantom bent on sabotage. Emery and Ruth crept toward the barn. Every sound, every rustle of leaves felt like a scream. As they neared the barn, Ruth froze. She heard a sound, a tiny, whimpering cry. It was a child. She peered through a knothole in the weathered wood, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A little girl, no older than 8, was curled up on a pile of straw. A heavy chain was fastened around her ankle, the other end bolted to a post. A scruffy dog was chained beside her. Ruth's breath hitched. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know he had a child." But as Emery looked closer, he saw the raw fear in the girl's eyes, the old bruises on her arms. This wasn't Luther's daughter. This was another victim. In that moment, their mission changed. This wasn't just about Ruth anymore. Emery used a tool from his saddlebag to snap the chain. The girl flinched away, shielding her face, expecting a blow. Ruth knelt beside her. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice gentle. "We're not going to hurt you." The girl looked up, her eyes too old, too haunted for a child. And then, from the wide-open barn door, a voice sliced through the darkness, dripping with amusement. "Well, I'll be damned. You brought me a present." Luther stood there, silhouetted against the night, a rifle in one hand and a lit torch in the other. 2 of his men stepped out from behind him, their own guns raised. "You came back, Ruthie," he sneered. "Just like I knew you would. I almost missed you." Ruth instinctively stepped in front of the little girl, shielding her with her own body. "Let the child go, Luther." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And you," he said, his eyes landing on Emery, "the brave rancher. You think courage is a shield? It's not. It's just a faster way to a shallow grave." Suddenly, a sharp whistle cut through the night. It was followed by a gunshot. The torch in Luther's hand exploded, showering him with sparks and plunging the barnyard into near darkness. From the tree line, the ranger stepped into the faint moonlight, his rifle smoking. "The next one won't be a warning," the ranger's voice boomed across the yard. Luther staggered back, clutching a bleeding hand. "You'll hang for this," he shrieked. "I have friends in this county, the judge, the sheriff." "Not anymore," the ranger called out, his voice echoing with cold satisfaction. "I sent them a little letter, all about you, Luther, about the land you stole, the men you bribed, and the girls you've been buying and selling for years." The ranger's words hung in the air, a death sentence. "You're a ghost now, Luther," the ranger said, "and no one's afraid of a ghost." But Luther wasn't a ghost yet. He was a cornered rat. With a furious roar, he raised his rifle, not at the ranger, not at Emery. He aimed it straight at Ruth, but he never got the shot off. Emery moved faster than lightning, tackling Luther with the force of a freight train. The 2 men crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs and fury. It wasn't a noble fight. It was brutal and raw. Emery wasn't fighting like a hero. He was fighting like a man who had already lost everything once and would be damned if he let it happen again. Fists flew. Curses were spat like venom. By the time Emery staggered to his feet, breathing heavily, Luther was a broken, bleeding mess on the ground. He was alive, but the fight was gone from him. The other 2 men, seeing their leader fall, had already vanished into the night. Ruth rushed to the little girl, wrapping her in her arms. The child clung to her, sobbing. The ranger walked over, knelt by Luther, and checked his pulse. "He'll live," he said grimly. "The law can have what's left of him." As the sun rose over the chaotic scene, casting long, peaceful shadows, the ranger saddled his horse. "You two gonna be all right?" he asked Emery. Emery looked at Ruth, who was gently stroking the little girl's hair. He nodded. "We will be now." The ranger tipped his hat, a silent acknowledgement passing between the two men. He rode off without a backward glance, a lone figure of justice disappearing into the morning mist. Emery, Ruth, and the girl, whose name they learned was Delilah, rode back to the ranch. They had won. They had survived. But as they rode, a new, unspoken question hung between them. They weren't just two people anymore. They were three, and they had no idea how to be a family. The town of Crossbend hadn't just forgotten about Ruth. They had buried her in whispers and assumptions. So when she walked into the church house that Sunday, holding the hand of a small, haunted-looking girl, with the quiet rancher Emery Clay at her side, the entire congregation fell silent. The preacher, a man who'd seen his share of hardship, fumbled his sermon notes. Ruth's shoulders were back, her chin was high, but the fear hadn't entirely left her eyes. It lurked there, a shadow in the corners. Emery stood beside her, his jaw set, his presence a silent, unmovable wall of protection. They sat in the back pew, a strange, patched-together family of survivors. After the service, the preacher approached them, his face a mixture of shock and something that looked a lot like shame. We thought you were gone," he stammered. "No, sir," Ruth said, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the quiet church. "You just stopped looking." The words hit him like a physical blow. He just nodded, humbled, and held out his hand. "Welcome home, child." But the town was a harder beast to tame. Luther's influence, even in his absence, clung to the place like a bad smell. Doors that had once been open were now shut tight. Eyes that used to greet her with a smile now slid away. But Emery didn't flinch. He walked beside her, his head held high, daring anyone to cast the first stone. Slowly, cautiously, things began to change. A loaf of bread left on the porch, a small sack of beans from a neighboring farmer, an old coat for Delilah, left anonymously at the gate. The town was watching, judging, and maybe, just maybe, starting to repent. The ranch became their sanctuary. Emery repaired the fences Luther's men had torn down. He built a new swing on the porch. He taught Delilah how to feed the horses, his large, calloused hand showing her how to keep her palm flat so they wouldn't nip. The girl began to thaw. Her flinches became less frequent. The terror in her eyes was slowly replaced by a cautious curiosity. She started to giggle, a small, bird-like sound that felt like a miracle. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ruth finally spoke the words that had been weighing on her heart. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, watching Delilah sleep on a rug by the hearth. "How to be safe." Emery leaned forward, his face softened by the firelight. "You don't have to know how," he said gently. "You just have to let yourself try." Delilah stirred, murmuring something in her sleep. "She calls me Mama sometimes," Ruth said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "She deserves better than a woman with so many broken pieces." "She deserves someone who loves her," Emery said, his voice firm. "That's all. That's everything." He looked at her then, a long, searching look that held a question neither of them was ready to ask. Not yet. But the world has a long memory for violence. Peace is a fragile thing. The knock on the door came on a cold autumn morning. It wasn't a neighborly rap. It was hard, official. Emery opened it to find 3 men standing on his porch. They weren't from Crossbend. They had the hard, merciless eyes of men who lived by the gun. "We're looking for Luther Kane," the tallest one said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "He owes us something he was holding for us." Emery's body went rigid. "Ain't no Luther here." The man's eyes flickered past Emery into the house. He saw Ruth standing in the kitchen, her face pale. His lips curled into a cold smile. "No," he said softly, "but I see he left the merchandise behind." Before the man could take another step, a shotgun appeared in Ruth's hands, the double barrels aimed squarely at his chest. "She's not merchandise," Ruth said, her voice shaking but full of ice. "She's my daughter." The man chuckled. "That's a nice thought, lady, but she's ours. We paid for her." Suddenly there was another knock, this one at the back door. They were surrounded. The next few moments were a blur of chaos and violence. Emery roared, grabbing his rifle from the wall. Ruth shoved Delilah toward the root cellar, the girl screaming in terror. The dog, the scruffy mutt they'd rescued from Luther's barn, launched itself at the tall man's legs, snarling and snapping. Gunfire erupted. Wood splintered. Windows shattered. It was a siege. But Emery and Ruth weren't running anymore. This was their land. This was their family. And they would defend it to the death. They fought with the desperation of people with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. By the time Sheriff Tannen and his deputies arrived, drawn by the sound of the gunshots echoing across the valley, the fight was over. 2 of the men lay dead in the yard. The others had fled. Emery was leaning against the porch, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder, his eyes blazing with adrenaline and fury. Ruth stood at the cellar door, her face smudged with gunpowder, Delilah clinging to her leg, sobbing. The sheriff took one look at the scene, at the bodies, at the defiant, bleeding family. "You folks all right?" he asked, his voice full of awe. "No," Emery said, wincing as he straightened up. "But we will be." That winter, as the first snows fell, Emery Clay and Ruth Malloy were married in the small church in Crossbend. Delilah stood between them, holding both their hands. It wasn't a marriage born of passion or romance. It was a fortress, a pact, a promise forged in blood and gunpowder. They were a family now, in name and in fact. But their enemies were still out there, and they still wanted the girl. The silence that followed the shootout was unnerving. Weeks turned into a month. The snow fell, blanketing the ranch in a deceptive layer of peace. Emery's shoulder healed. The shattered windows were replaced, but an unspoken tension remained. They were living on borrowed time, and they all knew it. Delilah's nightmares got worse. She would wake up screaming, not about Luther, but about another man. A man with hair as white as the snow outside and eyes as cold as ice. A man with a belt. Ruth would hold her, rocking her back and forth, whispering promises of safety that she wasn't sure she could keep. One day, Emery was in town when he saw him. A stranger, standing across the street just watching the general store. He was tall, well-dressed, with a shock of pure white hair that seemed unnatural. When the man saw Emery looking, he just smiled, a slow, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes, and then he turned and walked away. Emery felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. He went straight to the sheriff. "A man came through on the stagecoach a few days back," the sheriff said, his face grim. "White hair, paid in cash, didn't give a name." The threat was no longer a faceless possibility. It had a name, a face, and it was here. That night, the real terror began. It started with a whistle outside the house, a long, eerie note that sounded like a twisted bird call. Then the voice, smooth and cruel, drifted out of the darkness. "I've come for what's mine, little bird," Delilah screamed. "That's him," she sobbed into Ruth's dress. "That's the man from my dreams." "You have one chance to walk away," Emery yelled, his rifle pointed at the darkened porch. A soft, mocking laugh was his only answer. "You think you saved her?" the white-haired man called out. "You don't know the first thing about her. You don't know why she cries when it rains, or why she flinches when a man raises his voice. I made her. She's got my blood in her veins." The taunt was designed to break them, to plant a seed of doubt. But it only hardened Emery's resolve. A shot rang out from the darkness. Emery fired back, and the night exploded into another volley of gunfire. This time it was different. This wasn't a clumsy gang of thugs. This was a calculated professional assault. Emery fought with grim efficiency, dropping one of the attackers while the other fled. But the white-haired man didn't run. He stepped into the moonlight, unarmed, that same terrifying smile on his face. "Shoot me," he dared Emery, "and you'll never know the truth. You'll never know what she really is." Another shot cracked the night air, but it didn't come from Emery's rifle. Sheriff Tannen and his deputies had arrived, silent and swift. The white-haired man dropped to the ground, a bullet in his shoulder. As they dragged him away, whimpering and cursing, Emery felt no victory, only a deep, chilling exhaustion. Later that night, Delilah, safe in Ruth's arms, whispered something that made Ruth's heart stop. He said he left something behind for me. He said he wasn't done." Ruth held her tighter, a new, terrible fear dawning. The man was captured, but his poison remained. What had he done to this child? What scars were still buried, waiting to surface? Just before dawn, Delilah sat bolt upright in bed, her eyes wide with a clarity that was terrifying. "I remember," she whispered. "What, sweetheart? What do you remember?" Ruth asked, her heart pounding. "He wasn't my father," Delilah said, her small voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. "He told me he was, but he lied. I had a mama before him. She had hair like yours, and she sang to me." The words hung in the air, a fragile, heartbreaking thread of hope. Delilah, or whoever she was, had a past, a real past, and they had just opened the door to a whole new world of secrets. The white-haired man died in a jail cell 2 counties over before he could stand trial. Infection, the official report said. But Emery suspected it was something quicker, something arranged by men who didn't want him to talk. Before he died, however, he left one last piece of his poison behind. A letter. It wasn't a confession. It was a boast. It found its way to Sheriff Tannen, who brought it to the ranch, his face grim. The letter detailed how the man hadn't just kidnapped Delilah. He'd bought her from her own uncle, a man who had taken her in after her mother's death and sold her for a handful of silver. The letter sent a chill through Ruth and Emery. This wasn't just one monster, it was a chain of them. But there was one more detail. Tucked away in the man's boot was something else, a small, faded blue ribbon. Emery remembered it. It had been tied in the girl's hair the day they found her. He handed it to Delilah. She turned it over and over in her small hands. Embroidered on the corner, in tiny, faded thread, were 2 letters. "Mr. May," the girl whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "My name was May. My mama called me May Rose, because I was born in the spring." The name settled over her like a warm blanket, a piece of her true self reclaimed from the darkness. From that day on, she was May Rose. The seasons turned. The fear began to recede, replaced by the steady, quiet rhythm of life on the ranch. May learned to read, devouring books with a hunger that amazed them all. She learned to ride, her laughter echoing across the pastures. She was healing. They were all healing. They had built a family not from shared blood, but from shared survival. They were a fortress, solid and secure. They thought the story was over. They were wrong. A year later, another knock came at their door. It was a woman, older, her face etched with years of worry, clutching a tattered newspaper clipping. "My name is Clara Ridge," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm looking for my niece. Her name is May Rose. She disappeared 3 years ago." She looked past them, into the house, and saw the girl standing in the kitchen, her eyes wide. The woman gasped, dropping the clipping. She fell to her knees. "May?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. It was her aunt, her mother's sister. Clara stayed for a week. She told them the story of May's mother, Charlotte Rose, a kind, gentle woman who had died of a fever. She told them of the treacherous brother who had sold his own flesh and blood. And she saw, in the way Emery looked at May, in the way Ruth held her, that the girl had been found not just by strangers, but by family. When Clara left, she did so with peace in her heart, knowing May was where she belonged. The circle, it seemed, was finally closed. The last ghost had been laid to rest. But the past always saves one last secret. Months later, a small plain package arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside, there was no letter, no threat, just a photograph. It was old and faded, the corners soft with age. It showed a beautiful young woman with kind eyes and chestnut hair, the same color as Ruth's. She was standing in a field of wildflowers, holding a laughing baby in her arms. On the back, in elegant looping script, were 2 words: Charlotte and May. Ruth stared at the photograph, her heart aching. It was May's mother. But who had sent it? How did they know? And then she saw it. The field of wildflowers in the photograph. It was the same field that grew just beyond the eastern ridge of their own property. And the woman, Charlotte, the gentle slope of her nose, the curve of her smile, it was hauntingly, impossibly familiar. It was the face of the woman Emery had described. The woman who baked cinnamon bread when she was nervous. His first wife. The woman who had died of a fever all those years ago. Emery came and stood behind her, looking at the photo over her shoulder. His breath caught in his throat. "That's," he whispered, his voice full of disbelief. "That's her. That's my Sarah." But the name on the back of the photo was Charlotte. The world tilted on its axis. The woman Emery had married, the woman he had buried, hadn't been Sarah. She had been Charlotte Rose, and the baby in the photograph, the baby with Emery's eyes and Charlotte's smile, was May. May wasn't just a foundling they had rescued. She was Emery's daughter, his own flesh and blood. Charlotte, his wife, hadn't died of a fever. She had run from her cruel brother who wanted her child, faking her own death and changing her name to protect her baby. She had made it as far as Emery's ranch, finding a brief, fragile peace before the real fever took her. And Ruth, the battered woman who had come looking for a place to disappear, had been led to the one place in the world where all the broken pieces of their lives could finally be made whole. She looked from the photograph to Emery's stunned face, and then to May, their daughter, who was watching them with a deep, knowing wisdom in her eyes. The scars of the past had not led them to ruin. They had led them home, to each other. The world is full of monsters like Luther Kane and the men who prey on the innocent. But it's also filled with quiet heroes like Emery and fierce survivors like Ruth. They show us that family isn't always about the blood you share, but about the love you're willing to fight for. If their story of finding light in the deepest darkness moved you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because you never know what secrets the next story will uncover.